Imagine waking up in a world where everything your civilization once knew, science, medicine, philosophy, had simply vanished. Not slowly fading, not evolving, but disappearing almost as if someone had reached into history itself and erased entire chapters. Libraries reduced to ash. Scholars silenced. Ideas that once shaped empires suddenly gone. But here's the question that refuses to go away: did knowledge truly disappear, or was it taken? In 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire fell, and with it, one of the greatest centers of human civilization collapsed into ruin. For centuries, Rome had stood as a symbol of order and intellect. Its roads connected distant lands, its laws structured societies, and its scholars preserved the works of thinkers like Aristotle and Plato. Their ideas had shaped philosophy, science, and politics for generations. Knowledge was not just valued, it was power. And then, almost suddenly, it was as if that power slipped through humanity's fingers. But empires don't collapse in a single moment. They decay slowly, like a once mighty structure weakening from within. Corruption seeps into leadership. Economic systems falter. Borders weaken. Outside forces push in while internal stability crumbles. By the time Rome finally fell, the collapse had already been years in the making. Yet what followed was something far more unsettling than political defeat. It wasn't just the empire that fell, it was the very foundation of knowledge that had supported it. Cities that once thrived became quiet shadows of their former selves. Trade routes that carried goods and ideas across continents broke apart. Communication slowed, then fractured entirely. But the most chilling transformation wasn't visible in crumbling buildings or abandoned roads. It was happening in the minds of people. Education began to vanish. Books became rare. Schools closed. The act of learning itself, once a pillar of Roman life, became something distant, almost unreachable. Entire generations grew up without access to the knowledge their ancestors had taken for granted. And when knowledge is no longer passed down, it doesn't just weaken, it disappears. Imagine centuries of discoveries, ideas, and innovations simply fading away because no one remained to teach them. Or perhaps, because no one was allowed to. History tells us that many great libraries were destroyed or abandoned during this time. The legendary Library of Alexandria, often remembered as the greatest collection of knowledge in the ancient world, stands as a haunting symbol. Though its exact fate is debated, its story represents something deeper: the vulnerability of human knowledge. When power shifts, knowledge becomes dangerous. Ideas can challenge authority. Truth can threaten control. And when truth becomes dangerous, it often doesn't survive. As Europe moved deeper into what would later be called the Dark Ages, fear began to replace curiosity. Superstition spread where science once thrived. Questioning the world became less about discovery and more about risk. Knowledge, which had once been celebrated, began to feel forbidden. But knowledge didn't disappear entirely. It didn't vanish into nothingness. Instead, it became concentrated, controlled by a select few. Literacy, once more widespread in Roman society, became rare. The ability to read and write was no longer a common skill, it became a privilege. And those who held that privilege held something far more powerful than wealth or weapons. They held the power to shape reality itself. Because when only a few people can read, only a few people can decide what is written. Religious institutions rose as the primary keepers of knowledge during this time. Monasteries became centers of learning, where monks carefully copied manuscripts by hand, preserving what they believed was important. But this preservation came with a quiet, unsettling question: who decided what was worth saving? Imagine standing in a room filled with books, knowing you could only choose a few to survive for future generations. Every decision you make shapes the understanding of history, science, and truth for centuries to come. What would you keep? What would you discard? And more importantly, what might you choose to hide? Because preserving knowledge is not the same as preserving all knowledge. It's possible that many works were lost simply due to chaos, neglect, or decay. But it's equally possible that some ideas were considered too dangerous to survive. Philosophies that challenged authority. Scientific theories that contradicted accepted beliefs. Discoveries that could shift power away from those who held it. If such ideas existed, would they have been protected, or erased? While Europe struggled through this period of decline, something remarkable was happening in other parts of the world. In the Islamic Golden Age, scholars were not only preserving ancient texts but expanding upon them. Works of Aristotle and other classical thinkers were translated, studied, and improved. Advances were made in mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. Knowledge had not disappeared. It had simply moved. This raises a question that challenges everything we think we know about the so-called Dark Ages. If knowledge was still thriving elsewhere, was the world truly in darkness? Or was the darkness limited to certain regions, and perhaps even exaggerated over time? The idea of the Dark Ages itself is worth questioning. The term suggests a period of complete intellectual and cultural decline, a time when humanity lost its way. But many historians now argue that this label is misleading, even unfair. There were still moments of innovation, still pockets of learning, still progress happening beneath the surface. So why has the image of darkness persisted so strongly? Because history is not just a collection of facts. It is a narrative. And narratives are shaped by those who tell them. If generations are taught that a certain period was empty, backward, or unimportant, they may never look deeper. They may never question what was truly happening beneath the surface. And if no one questions the narrative, it becomes accepted as truth. But what if the narrative is incomplete? What if the story of disappearing knowledge is not just about loss, but about control? Consider the pattern. An empire falls. Systems collapse. Knowledge becomes scarce. Literacy is restricted. Information is controlled by a small group. Ideas are filtered, preserved selectively, or possibly erased. Does this sound like random chaos? Or does it begin to feel like something more deliberate? It's easy to assume that the loss of knowledge was simply an unfortunate consequence of a collapsing civilization. And to some extent, that is certainly true. But history is rarely that simple. Power dynamics do not disappear when empires fall, they shift. And those who rise in times of chaos often shape the future in ways that are not immediately visible. If you had the power to decide what future generations would know, what would you do with it? Would you preserve everything, even ideas that threatened your authority? Or would you quietly ensure that certain knowledge never made it forward? Even today, historians continue to uncover fragments of the past. Lost manuscripts hidden in forgotten places. Ancient texts rediscovered after centuries of obscurity. Each discovery adds a piece to the puzzle, offering glimpses into what may have been lost. But the puzzle is incomplete. And perhaps it always will be. Because once knowledge is truly gone, it doesn't just disappear from books. It disappears from memory. From culture. From the very way people think and understand the world. Entire possibilities vanish without anyone even realizing they ever existed. And that is what makes this mystery so unsettling. It's not just about what was lost. It's about what we don't even know we've lost. Somewhere in the silence of history, there may be ideas that could have changed everything. Discoveries that could have advanced civilization centuries ahead of its time. Philosophies that could have reshaped societies. But if those ideas were erased, intentionally or not, they are now beyond our reach. Gone not just from history, but from imagination itself. And so the question lingers, growing heavier the more you think about it. Did knowledge vanish because civilization collapsed? Or did civilization collapse because knowledge was taken away? And if something as powerful as human knowledge could disappear once, quietly slipping through the cracks of history, what's stopping it from happening again? Darkness is a powerful word. It doesn't just describe the absence of light, it evokes fear, uncertainty, and the unknown. When we hear about the Dark Ages, we imagine a world swallowed by ignorance, a time when progress stopped and humanity stumbled blindly through history. But what if that darkness wasn't as natural as it seems? What if it was constructed? After the fall of Rome, Europe didn't just lose political stability, it lost its sense of direction. The systems that once guided daily life, from governance to education, began to unravel. Without a central authority to maintain order, regions became isolated. Communication broke down. Ideas that once traveled freely were now trapped within small, disconnected communities. And in isolation, truth begins to change. Imagine living in a world where your understanding of reality is limited to what you're told by a handful of people. No books to verify facts. No widespread education to encourage questioning. No alternative perspectives to challenge beliefs. In such a world, truth becomes fragile, easily shaped, easily controlled. And control thrives in darkness. The label, Dark Ages, suggests a time when knowledge simply faded away, but the reality is far more complex. Darkness didn't fall all at once. It crept in slowly, quietly, almost unnoticed. One generation lost access to certain ideas. The next forgot them entirely. Over time, the absence of knowledge became normal. And when something becomes normal, people stop questioning it. Fear began to replace curiosity. Natural phenomena that had once been studied scientifically were now often explained through superstition. Eclipses, comets, diseases, these were no longer subjects of inquiry but signs, omens, punishments. The world became less about understanding and more about believing. But belief, when left unchecked, can be shaped. Those who held authority during this time didn't just guide society, they defined its reality. And when reality is defined by a small group, it raises an unsettling question: were people living in darkness, or were they being kept in it? Because there's a difference. A natural darkness is temporary. It lifts as knowledge returns, as discovery resumes, as curiosity reignites. But a controlled darkness is different. It persists. It deepens. It resists change. And perhaps most dangerously, it convinces people that it is normal. During this period, institutions gained immense influence over daily life. They became the centers of power, not just spiritually, but intellectually. They determined what could be taught, what could be written, and what could be questioned. Knowledge was no longer freely explored, it was carefully managed. This doesn't mean that everything was suppressed or that progress completely stopped. There were still scholars, still thinkers, still moments of innovation. But those moments existed within boundaries that were not always visible. And invisible boundaries are the hardest to challenge. Because you cannot question what you cannot see. Imagine trying to explore the limits of knowledge when you don't even know where those limits are. Imagine believing that what you've been taught is the complete truth, unaware that entire areas of understanding have been removed from your reach. That is the true nature of darkness, not just the absence of light, but the illusion that there is no more light to find. Yet even in this controlled environment, cracks began to appear. Whispers of forgotten knowledge surfaced from time to time. Ancient texts, long thought lost, re-emerged in unexpected places. Travelers brought stories of distant lands where learning still thrived, where scholars studied mathematics, medicine, and philosophy with a depth that seemed almost impossible in a dark world. These stories must have felt like glimpses into another reality, a reminder that the darkness was not universal. And that realization alone is powerful. Because if light exists somewhere, then darkness is not inevitable. It becomes a choice, or a condition. While Europe struggled with fragmentation and intellectual limitation, other parts of the world were experiencing growth. In cities far from the former Roman Empire, knowledge was being preserved, translated, and expanded. Scholars built upon the works of ancient thinkers, making new discoveries and pushing the boundaries of understanding. This contrast is impossible to ignore. If the world truly entered a dark age, how could such progress exist at the same time? The answer may lie not in the absence of knowledge, but in its distribution. Knowledge was not gone, it was uneven. And uneven knowledge creates imbalance. In regions where knowledge thrived, societies advanced. In regions where it was restricted, progress slowed. Over time, this imbalance shaped the course of history, creating divisions that would take centuries to overcome. But imbalance alone does not explain everything. Because even within Europe, knowledge did not disappear completely. It survived in fragments, preserved in monasteries, passed down through limited circles. Yet it rarely spread beyond those boundaries. Why? Was it simply because of societal collapse and lack of infrastructure? Or was there a deeper reason, an unspoken understanding that certain knowledge should remain contained? It's difficult to answer this question definitively, but patterns begin to emerge when you look closely. Knowledge that aligned with existing structures of power was more likely to be preserved and shared. Knowledge that challenged those structures was more likely to fade into obscurity. Not always intentionally. Not always through direct suppression. Sometimes, all it takes is neglect. If a text is not copied, it disappears. If an idea is not taught, it dies. If a question is not asked, it is forgotten. And over time, these small acts of omission can reshape entire civilizations. This is where the concept of a cover-up becomes less about conspiracy and more about consequence. Not every loss of knowledge requires a deliberate act. Sometimes, the system itself ensures that only certain ideas survive. But that doesn't make the outcome any less significant. Because the result is the same, a world where the full scope of human understanding is no longer accessible. As centuries passed, the effects of this intellectual narrowing became deeply ingrained. Generations grew up within the same framework, accepting its limits as natural. The absence of certain ideas was no longer noticed, because there was no memory of them ever existing. And when there is no memory, there is no resistance. Yet history has a way of resurfacing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, change began to emerge. Contact with other cultures reintroduced lost knowledge. Trade routes reopened, bringing not just goods, but ideas. Translations of ancient texts began to circulate once more, reigniting curiosity and challenging long-held assumptions. It was as if the darkness was beginning to lift. But even then, the transition was not immediate. The reintroduction of knowledge did not simply restore what had been lost. It had to be rediscovered, reinterpreted, rebuilt. Centuries of absence had left gaps that could not easily be filled. And some gaps remain. Even today, we cannot say with certainty what was lost during that period. We can only infer, speculate, and piece together fragments. There may have been ideas, discoveries, even entire fields of knowledge that disappeared completely, leaving no trace behind. That is the most unsettling part of all. Not what we know we've lost. But what we don't know we've lost. Because how do you search for something when you don't even know it exists? The more you think about it, the more the concept of the Dark Ages begins to shift. It stops being a simple period of decline and becomes something far more complex, a time shaped by power, by control, by the selective preservation and loss of knowledge. A time where darkness may not have been absolute, but carefully maintained. And that brings us back to the question that continues to echo through history. Was the world truly plunged into darkness? Or was the light simply hidden from view? Because if the light was hidden once, filtered, controlled, restricted, then it means something else is possible. It means that history, as we understand it, may not be the complete story. And if that's true, then what else are we missing? There is something deeply unsettling about the idea that knowledge can be controlled, not just lost, not just forgotten, but carefully guarded. Because if knowledge is power, then those who control it don't just influence the world, they shape it. As the centuries of uncertainty unfolded, a new kind of authority quietly solidified itself across much of Europe. It wasn't built on armies or wealth alone, but on something far more enduring, access to information. In a world where most people could neither read nor write, the ability to understand written words became almost sacred. And those who possessed that ability became something else entirely, gatekeepers. In monasteries scattered across the landscape, monks worked in silence, copying texts by hand. Page after page, line after line, they preserved fragments of the past. These were not just religious writings, but also pieces of ancient philosophy, medicine, and science, echoes of a world that had nearly disappeared. At first glance, this seems like an act of preservation. And in many ways, it was. Without these efforts, even more knowledge might have been lost forever. But preservation raises a quiet, uncomfortable question. Who decided what was worth preserving? Imagine standing in a dimly lit room, surrounded by manuscripts, some fragile, some incomplete, some filled with ideas that challenge everything you believe. You don't have the time or resources to save them all. You must choose. Do you preserve the texts that reinforce the world as you understand it? Or do you preserve the ones that could change it? Every choice shapes the future. Because every text that is copied survives. And every text that is ignored, disappears. Over time, this process created a filter, one that determined which ideas would move forward through history and which would quietly fade away. It wasn't always a conscious act of suppression. Sometimes it was preference. Sometimes it was caution. Sometimes it was fear. But the result was the same. Knowledge became curated. And curated knowledge is not the same as complete knowledge. Within these walls of preservation, access remained limited. The average person would never see these texts, never read their contents, never even know they existed. Knowledge was not shared widely, it was contained within small, controlled environments. This containment created a divide, one that shaped society in ways that are easy to overlook. On one side were the few who understood the written word, who could interpret texts, who had access to ideas. On the other side were the many, whose understanding of the world came almost entirely from what they were told. And when information flows in only one direction, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes narrative. Narrative is powerful. It tells people what to believe, what to fear, what to accept. It doesn't just inform, it defines reality. And when only a select group controls that narrative, their influence extends far beyond knowledge itself. They don't just preserve history. They shape it. This is where the idea of hidden history begins to take form, not as a dramatic secret buried beneath layers of deception, but as something quieter, more subtle. A history shaped by omission. By absence. By the quiet disappearance of ideas that never made it forward. Because not all control is loud. Some of it is silent. Consider this, if a discovery is made but never recorded, it vanishes. If it is recorded but never copied, it fades. If it is copied but never shared, it remains hidden. At every stage, there is an opportunity for knowledge to slip away, not necessarily through deliberate action, but through the simple act of not passing it on. And over centuries, those small losses add up. Entire perspectives can disappear. Entire possibilities can be erased. There are moments in history where fragments resurface, unexpected reminders that the past was more complex than we thought. Ancient manuscripts discovered in forgotten places. Translations that reveal ideas far ahead of their time. Hints that suggest knowledge once existed that we can barely comprehend today. Each discovery raises the same haunting thought. If this survived, what didn't? Because for every text that is found, there may be countless others that are gone forever. Ideas that could have changed the course of science, medicine, philosophy, lost not in a dramatic moment of destruction, but in the slow, quiet passage of time. And the most unsettling part is that we may never know. Because how do you search for something when you don't even know it's missing? This is the true power of hidden knowledge, not just that it exists, but that its absence goes unnoticed. People build their understanding of the world based on what is available to them. They don't question what isn't there, because they have no reason to believe it ever was. In this way, control over knowledge doesn't just shape the present. It shapes the limits of imagination. If certain ideas are never introduced, they are never explored. If certain questions are never asked, they are never answered. Entire paths of progress can be closed off without anyone realizing they were ever possible. And that changes everything. Because history is often seen as a linear progression, a steady movement from ignorance to understanding. But what if that progression wasn't smooth? What if it was interrupted, redirected, even restricted at times? What if the path we followed was not the only one available? It's a difficult idea to accept, because it challenges something fundamental, the belief that history naturally leads us forward. That over time, we always move closer to truth. But history is shaped by people. And people make choices. Choices about what to record. What to preserve. What to share. And sometimes, what to leave behind. These choices, repeated over generations, create a version of history that feels complete, but may not be. A version that tells a story, but not necessarily the entire story. And once that version is established, it becomes incredibly difficult to change. Because new ideas must not only prove themselves, they must also challenge what is already accepted. And challenging accepted knowledge has never been easy. It requires evidence, persistence, and often, the willingness to face resistance. Sometimes, that resistance is strong enough to silence ideas before they can take root. And when that happens, the cycle continues. Knowledge is filtered. Narratives are reinforced. Gaps remain hidden. Yet despite all of this, history is not completely sealed. It leaks. It reveals itself in fragments, in inconsistencies, in discoveries that don't quite fit the established narrative. These moments are small, but they matter. Because they remind us of something important. That what we know, may not be everything. And what we don't know, may be far more significant than we realize. As the centuries moved forward, the control over knowledge began to shift. Slowly, access expanded. Literacy increased. Texts became more widely available. The walls that once contained information started to weaken. But even as this change began, the effects of the past remained. Because once knowledge is lost, it doesn't simply return. It has to be rediscovered. Rebuilt. Reimagined. And some things may never come back at all. Which brings us to a final, lingering thought, one that sits quietly beneath everything we've explored. If knowledge was once controlled, filtered, and possibly hidden. If entire ideas could disappear without a trace. If history itself can be shaped by what is preserved and what is not. Then how much of what we believe today is complete? And how much of it, is simply what survived? There is something even more unsettling than the idea of lost knowledge, and that is the possibility that some of it wasn't just lost, it was forgotten so completely that it no longer even feels missing. Because when something disappears without a trace, it doesn't leave behind questions. It leaves behind silence. As centuries passed through what we now call the Dark Ages, the world did not stand still. People lived, built, fought, and believed. Life continued. Kingdoms rose and fell. Stories were told, traditions were followed, and societies adapted to their new reality. But beneath that surface, something deeper was happening. The boundaries of human understanding were quietly shrinking. Not in a dramatic, visible way, but gradually, almost invisibly. Each generation inherited slightly less than the one before it. Not enough to notice immediately, but enough that over time, the difference became profound. Imagine a vast library slowly losing books, one shelf at a time. At first, no one notices. Then one day, someone walks in and realizes entire sections are gone. But by then, no one remembers what those sections contained. That is how knowledge truly disappears. And yet, every so often, history leaves behind strange clues, small fragments that suggest the past may have been more advanced, more complex, or more mysterious than we assume. Ancient structures that seem too precise for their time. Medical practices that appear unexpectedly sophisticated. Philosophical ideas that feel far ahead of the era they came from. These fragments don't fit neatly into the narrative of a world lost in darkness. They feel out of place. Almost like echoes of something that once existed more fully. Take the incredible engineering of ancient Rome itself, roads that lasted for centuries, aqueducts that carried water across vast distances, structures that still stand today. These weren't simple achievements. They required deep understanding of materials, mathematics, and design. And yet, after the empire fell, much of that expertise seemed to vanish. Not entirely, but enough that similar feats became rare for a long time. Why? Did people suddenly become less capable? Or did the systems that supported that knowledge collapse, taking the knowledge with them? Because knowledge doesn't exist in isolation. It depends on teachers, institutions, resources, and stability. Remove those, and even the greatest discoveries can fade. But even that doesn't fully explain the gaps. There are moments where it feels as if something more than just infrastructure was lost. As if certain lines of thinking, certain approaches to understanding the world, simply stopped being explored. And when entire ways of thinking disappear, the loss is deeper than any single invention. It becomes a loss of perspective. Consider medicine. Ancient civilizations had developed surprising insights into anatomy, surgery, and herbal treatments. Some of this knowledge survived, but much of it became fragmented. Practices that may have once been widespread became rare or misunderstood. What happens when knowledge like that is interrupted? Progress doesn't just pause. It resets. Generations have to relearn what was already known. Mistakes are repeated. Discoveries are delayed. And the timeline of human advancement stretches longer than it might have otherwise. Now imagine how many times that could have happened. How many discoveries were made, and then lost. How many ideas were explored, and then abandoned. How many breakthroughs were within reach, but slipped away because the knowledge needed to achieve them disappeared. It's a thought that changes how you see history. Because instead of a straight path forward, it begins to look like something else entirely, a path with gaps, detours, and missing pieces. A journey where progress is not just about moving ahead, but about recovering what was left behind. And in those gaps, there is room for mystery. Some historians point to the idea that knowledge wasn't completely lost, but rather scattered. Broken into fragments and carried across different regions, preserved in different forms. What disappeared in one place might have survived in another, hidden within a different culture, a different language, a different context. If that's true, then the story of lost knowledge becomes even more complex. Because it means that pieces of the past may still exist, just not where we expect them. It means that history is not just buried in time, but dispersed across it. And perhaps some of those pieces are still waiting to be found. But there's another layer to this, one that is harder to prove, but impossible to ignore. The idea that some knowledge may not have been lost accidentally. That some ideas may have been deliberately set aside, ignored, or even suppressed, not through dramatic acts of destruction, but through something far quieter. Disinterest. Neglect. Avoidance. Because not all knowledge is comfortable. Some ideas challenge deeply held beliefs. Some discoveries disrupt existing systems. Some truths create more questions than answers. And throughout history, there have been moments where society has resisted ideas not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. If such moments occurred during this period, they would leave behind very little evidence. No clear record of suppression. No obvious sign of conflict. Just absence. And absence is easy to overlook. But its impact can be enormous. Because when knowledge disappears, it doesn't just affect the present, it reshapes the future. It determines what questions are asked, what problems are solved, what possibilities are imagined. And if certain possibilities are never imagined, they are never pursued. That is the true cost of forgotten knowledge. Not just what was lost, but what could have been. Even today, we occasionally encounter discoveries that seem to arrive too early, ideas or inventions that appear before their time, only to be ignored or forgotten, and then rediscovered centuries later. These moments hint at something deeper, a pattern that suggests progress is not always continuous. Sometimes, it flickers. Appearing briefly, then disappearing again. Like a signal trying to break through the noise. And each time it disappears, the cycle begins again, discovery, loss, rediscovery. It's almost as if history is trying to remember something, but can't quite hold on to it. Which leads to a question that feels both fascinating and unsettling. How much of what we consider new today is actually rediscovered? How many of our greatest achievements are truly original, and how many are echoes of ideas that existed long before, lost and found again across time? The more you think about it, the more the past begins to feel less like a distant, completed story and more like a puzzle, one that is missing pieces we may never recover. And yet, we keep searching. Because there is something deeply human about the desire to understand where we came from. To uncover what was lost. To piece together the fragments and see the bigger picture. But what if the bigger picture is incomplete? What if there are entire chapters of history that we will never read, not because they are hidden, but because they no longer exist? That possibility changes everything. It means that our understanding of the past is not just limited, it is fundamentally shaped by absence. And if that is true, then the story of the Dark Ages is not just about a time of decline. It is about a time when the limits of human knowledge were quietly rewritten. A time when the boundaries of what was known, and what could be known, were narrowed in ways that still affect us today. And perhaps most importantly, it is a reminder that knowledge is fragile. It can be built over centuries, and lost in generations. It can shape civilizations, and vanish without a trace. And once it's gone, recovering it is not guaranteed. Which brings us to a thought that lingers long after the story is told. If entire ideas, discoveries, and ways of thinking could disappear once. If history itself can forget what it once knew. Then what might still be missing? And more importantly, what might we never realize was there in the first place? It can be built over centuries, and lost in generations. It can shape civilizations, and vanish without a trace. And once it's gone, recovering it is not guaranteed. Which brings us to a thought that lingers long after the story is told. If entire ideas, discoveries, and ways of thinking could disappear once. If history itself can forget what it once knew. Then what might still be missing? And more importantly, what might we never realize was there in the first place? And now we arrive at the most unsettling part of this entire story, not the fall of empires, not the loss of books, not even the silence of forgotten ideas. But the possibility that what we call history isn't the full story. Because when you step back and look at everything together, the collapse of Rome, the disappearance of knowledge, the control of information, the fragments that don't quite fit, you begin to notice something strange. It doesn't feel like a clean break. It feels like a rewrite. Not in the sense of a single event or a grand conspiracy carried out in the shadows, but something far more subtle. A slow reshaping. A quiet filtering. A process where, over time, certain ideas survived while others didn't, and those survivors became the foundation of everything we believe today. And once a foundation is set, everything built on top of it feels solid, even if something underneath is missing. Think about how we understand the past. We rely on records, texts, artifacts, pieces of evidence that have endured across centuries. But survival is not the same as completeness. What we have is not everything that existed. It is only what made it through. And what makes it through is not always random. Sometimes it is preserved because it is useful. Sometimes because it aligns with dominant beliefs. Sometimes simply because it was copied more often than something else. And sometimes, because nothing stood in its way. But what about the ideas that did face resistance? The ones that challenged authority, disrupted systems, or simply didn't fit within the worldview of their time? Those ideas didn't always survive. And when they disappeared, they took something with them: alternative paths, different ways of thinking, possibilities that could have led history in entirely different directions. This is where the idea of a cover-up becomes more complex. Because a cover-up doesn't always require intention. It doesn't always need secrecy, or coordination, or a hidden group pulling strings behind the scenes. Sometimes, all it takes is a system where certain ideas are more likely to survive than others. Over time, that system does the work on its own. Filtering, shaping, narrowing, until what remains feels complete, even if it isn't. And that's what makes this so difficult to grasp. Because if history has been shaped in this way, not fully controlled, but influenced, guided, and limited, then the version of the past we know is not necessarily false. But it may not be whole. And that distinction matters. Because a partial truth can feel just as convincing as a complete one. It answers questions. It provides explanations. It creates a sense of understanding. But it also leaves gaps that are easy to overlook because we don't know they're there. And those gaps may hold the most important pieces. Imagine trying to solve a puzzle without knowing how many pieces are missing. You might think you've completed it, satisfied with the image in front of you. But if entire sections are gone, the picture you see is not the full reality, it's just the part that remains. That is what history may be. A picture that feels complete, but isn't. And the Dark Ages, often described as a time of ignorance and decline, may actually represent something far more significant. Not just a period where knowledge faded, but a period where the structure of knowledge itself was altered. Where access became limited. Where ideas became filtered. Where the boundaries of understanding were quietly redrawn. And once those boundaries were set, they shaped everything that came after. The Renaissance, often seen as a rebirth of knowledge, suddenly takes on a different meaning. It wasn't just about discovering new ideas, it was about rediscovering old ones. Recovering fragments of a past that had been partially lost. But even then, it was incomplete. Because you can only rediscover what still exists. Anything that was completely erased, remains gone. And that means the knowledge that returned during the Renaissance, as powerful as it was, may have been only a fraction of what once existed. A glimpse, not the whole picture. This leads to a question that is both simple and profound. What if human history is not a steady climb forward, but a cycle of discovery and loss? A pattern where knowledge is gained, reaches a peak, and then, through collapse, control, or circumstance, is reduced, scattered, or forgotten, only to be rediscovered again later. If that pattern is real, then the Dark Ages may not be unique. They may be just one example of something that has happened before, and could happen again. Because the factors that lead to the loss of knowledge, instability, concentration of power, control over information, are not limited to the past. They exist in every era. Even ours. Today, we live in a world where information feels unlimited. Knowledge is accessible in ways that would have been unimaginable centuries ago. With a single device, we can learn almost anything, connect with anyone, explore ideas from every corner of the world. It feels like the opposite of darkness. But access is not the same as understanding. And abundance is not the same as preservation. Because even in a world full of information, control still exists. Algorithms decide what we see. Systems prioritize certain ideas over others. Narratives form, spread, and solidify, often without us realizing how they are shaped. The difference is that the process is faster, and less visible. And that raises a final, unsettling possibility. That the loss of knowledge does not always look like burning libraries or collapsing empires. Sometimes, it looks like information being buried under more information. Sometimes, it looks like important ideas being ignored, overlooked, or dismissed. Sometimes, it looks like silence, hidden within noise. And if that's true, then the lesson of the past becomes more than just a story. It becomes a warning. Because the disappearance of knowledge is not just something that happened once. It is something that can happen whenever the conditions allow it. Whenever access is limited. Whenever ideas are filtered. Whenever people stop questioning what they are told. And perhaps that is the most important question of all, not just about the past, but about the present. Are we seeing the full picture? Or just the part that has survived? Because if history has taught us anything, it's this. What is lost is not always obvious. What is missing is not always noticed. And what is forgotten, can change everything. So the next time you hear the phrase, Dark Ages, remember this. It may not have been a time when the world lost its knowledge completely. It may have been a time when knowledge became something else. Something controlled. Something limited. Something hidden, just out of reach. And if that's true, then the greatest cover-up in history may not be a single event, or a single secret. It may be the quiet, gradual shaping of everything we think we know. A story written not just by what was recorded, but by what was left out.